The plane had just started its descent, and the dull hum of the engines blended with the chatter of passengers and the rustling of seatbelts. Sarah, the flight attendant, moved up and down the aisles with practiced precision, her mind on the smooth landing ahead. She had done this thousands of times. Her role was routine: greet passengers, ensure their comfort, and make sure everything ran as smoothly as possible. But that afternoon, something was different. The moment that would change everything for her came unexpectedly, in a way no one could have predicted. As she approached the next seat, Sarah noticed the man in 4C. He was calm, collected, and sitting upright with his eyes focused ahead, but there was something about him that felt out of place. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was his sharp, authoritative posture, or the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen much more than an ordinary traveler. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored jacket, a deep navy blue that stood out among the casual attire of the other passengers. His face, though mostly stoic, had a presence, a quiet intensity that caught her attention. She didn't recognize him, but that didn't surprise her. Every day, there were dozens of new faces in her section of the plane. Sarah reached for the small glove compartment, a habit when preparing for meal service, but her hands were shaking more than usual. She grabbed the latex gloves, the ones she used to handle anything that might make her skin react. Someone could have had a peanut allergy, or there could be contamination she didn't want to risk. Her heart was racing. It wasn't the first time she'd worn gloves in her career, but something about this moment felt different. She wasn't sure why, but something about him made her instinctively grab them. As she approached 4C with the gloves already half on, Sarah noticed a few eyes glancing her way, whispers that seemed to travel faster than usual. She had worked with people from all walks of life and had never paid attention to assumptions before. But as she neared his row, it became clear that her actions were being closely observed. The murmurs rose, and some passengers exchanged looks. They seemed to be whispering about her behavior, and she could feel their gazes shift uncomfortably between her and the man in 4C. As she approached his row, she hesitated. Her mind raced, wondering why she had done it. She hadn't even thought to take the gloves off before approaching him. It wasn't as if she had any intention to treat him differently than any other passenger, but there was something she couldn't shake, the strange, unsettling feeling that this encounter would become something more than just another routine flight. She stood at the edge of the aisle, still unsure of what to say or do next. It was in that moment of hesitation that the passenger in 4C looked directly at her. His gaze was steady, not confrontational, but piercing in a way that made Sarah feel suddenly self-conscious. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his eyes, a question, an uncertainty. As she stood there, gloves half on, she began to wonder if he could see the anxiety building up in her chest. She had been a flight attendant for over 5 years and had served hundreds of passengers, yet never before had a simple meal service felt like it might be the beginning of something far more significant. Then, unexpectedly, the silence between them was broken. Michael, the man in 4C, spoke. His voice was calm, measured, with a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I see you're preparing to serve me with gloves," he said softly. Sarah blinked, unsure of how to respond. She had anticipated questions, perhaps irritation, or confusion, but this wasn't what she expected. There was a subtle tension in his voice, not of accusation, but of something deeper, a subtle weight to his words that she couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered, feeling herself flush. "It's just part of the service. You know, for hygiene reasons. It's nothing personal." But even as she said it, she felt the truth slip away from her. She hadn't thought it through. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. The passengers around them, who had been gossiping in low voices, quieted. They were all watching now, waiting for a reaction, a resolution. Sarah's chest tightened. The gloves, once just a simple gesture of cleanliness, had suddenly become a symbol of what, she didn't know. But it was clear they had taken on a significance she hadn't anticipated. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Sarah was painfully aware of the scrutiny. As the minutes passed, the weight of what she had done lingered in the air, making everything feel off balance. She had done nothing wrong, at least not consciously. But the room seemed to speak a different language, one that was far more critical, far more complex. She was suddenly the center of attention, and not in the way she had imagined. The actions that had once been second nature to her now felt laden with meaning she couldn't fully grasp. And then, as she stood there with the gloves halfway on, a thought struck her: something was terribly wrong. What had she just done? Had she made an assumption? Was this really about hygiene, or was there something deeper? The flight had just started, and already, this simple meal service had become something much bigger. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of an encounter that would change the course of the entire flight. Sarah tried to shake off the discomfort that lingered in the air, but the unease only seemed to grow as she hovered in the aisle, gloves still half on. The murmurs from the passengers around her grew louder, their whispers now filled with judgment. Her eyes flicked nervously from one face to another, some showing confusion, others outright disapproval. For a split second, Sarah thought she might have imagined it, but it was real, the way the atmosphere seemed to change in an instant, like a weight had descended over the cabin. The passengers weren't just watching her now, they were judging her, trying to make sense of the situation, speculating about her actions. What were they thinking? Why did they all seem so uncomfortable? She couldn't remember the last time she felt this exposed. She had worked hundreds of flights, seen hundreds of faces, but never had she felt so out of place in her own role. This wasn't just about serving drinks or handing out snacks, it was about something more. But what? Why was she suddenly questioning everything? Her hands shook slightly as she finally removed the gloves, stuffing them awkwardly into her pocket. She couldn't quite bring herself to take them off completely, though. The gloves had become a symbol of something she didn't understand yet, and Sarah wasn't sure how to handle it. Michael's gaze had never left her, and that's when she noticed it, the quiet confidence in his eyes. It wasn't arrogance, but it was a kind of strength, something that seemed to emanate from him effortlessly. His posture was erect, but not rigid, his body language calm but assertive. He was unflinching in his gaze, a silent presence in the middle of the tension. Sarah had to admit, he was different from the usual passengers she encountered. He wasn't just another traveler going from one place to the next. There was a depth to him that she couldn't quite pinpoint. For some reason, it made her feel like she had stumbled into a situation she wasn't prepared for. As Sarah gathered her thoughts, she reminded herself that she had no reason to be worried. She had done nothing wrong, at least not intentionally. It was just gloves. She had worn gloves countless times before. There was no reason for anyone to be so concerned about a simple act of cleanliness, right? But that was the problem. The very fact that she felt the need to justify herself showed how the dynamics of the moment had shifted. She was no longer just a flight attendant doing her job. She had become the subject of speculation, and it made her feel like she was under a microscope. In the midst of this, Michael spoke again, his voice calm, almost as if he were trying to put her at ease. "I understand," he said. "You're just doing your job. But I want you to know. I've been in situations like this before. This isn't the first time I've had to deal with assumptions. And I'm sure it won't be the last." The words caught Sarah off guard. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or more confused. What did he mean by that? What kind of situations had he been in where people had made assumptions about him? She had assumed the gloves were simply a precaution, something she had done without thinking, but now it seemed as though there was a history she hadn't been aware of. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "That wasn't my intention. It's just part of the routine. I've never had any complaints before." Michael's expression softened slightly, but there was still something enigmatic in his eyes. "It's not you," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's never the person directly involved. It's the environment we create. The assumptions people make without knowing the full story." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the words he spoke felt heavy, like they were part of a much larger conversation. She felt herself floundering, trying to grasp at the meaning of his words, trying to understand why this moment had become so much more than a simple service call. And then, just as suddenly as the tension had built, Michael broke the silence with a surprising declaration. "I'm not just some random passenger, you know," he said, his tone casual yet carrying an underlying weight. "I'm a former military officer. I've had my share of experiences where people looked at me and made judgments before I even opened my mouth." Sarah froze, caught off guard. She didn't know what to say. Michael wasn't just an ordinary man. He was someone with a past, someone with a story that wasn't immediately visible. The weight of his words settled into her chest like a stone. She had assumed so much in such a short time. She had assumed that her actions were just part of the routine. She had assumed he was just another passenger. But now, she was realizing how wrong she had been. For a brief moment, Sarah was speechless, unsure of what to do with the information Michael had just shared. She had been so focused on her own actions, on justifying herself to the passengers, on making sure everything went smoothly, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. But Michael wasn't done. "There's more to this," he said, leaning slightly forward. "I've lived through enough situations where people reacted based on assumptions. It's a way of life for some of us. But I choose not to let it define me. You shouldn't have to either." The weight of his words hit Sarah harder than she expected. It wasn't just about the gloves anymore. It wasn't just about the tension in the cabin. It was about something deeper, a conversation about race, assumptions, and the unseen battles that people faced every day. As much as Sarah wanted to go back to the routine, to dismiss it all as a simple misunderstanding, she realized there was no turning back. The gloves had become a symbol of something much larger than her, something that would change the course of this flight in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The moment hung between them, heavy and still. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger than herself, something that was going to challenge her in ways she wasn't prepared for. But she also knew one thing for certain: nothing would be the same again. The air between them seemed to hum with an almost palpable energy, the quiet tension reverberating through the cabin. The other passengers, now more than ever, were keenly aware of the interaction unfolding before them. Sarah could feel their eyes, waiting for something, perhaps for an apology, perhaps for a confrontation, but more than anything, they were waiting for resolution. It was clear that the gloves had become more than a simple accessory, they had become a symbol, a catalyst for something much larger than she had ever anticipated. Sarah's mind raced. What had just happened? Michael had revealed so much in such a few words. He wasn't just another passenger, not just some guy who might feel uncomfortable with gloves on, but someone who had been through a series of assumptions and judgments that Sarah couldn't even begin to understand. What had he meant by "I've had my share of experiences where people looked at me and made judgments before I even opened my mouth"? Was he implying that she, too, had judged him in that moment? The thought stung, even though she didn't consciously feel any prejudice. But perhaps that was the problem, she hadn't thought much at all. It was a reflex. She had grabbed the gloves, because it was what she had always done, without questioning why. Now, standing before Michael, she began to wonder, had she unwittingly put him into a box, as so many people before her had done to him? Michael, as though sensing her inner turmoil, spoke again, but this time his tone had softened. "Look, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I just want you to understand. You're not the first person to do this, and you won't be the last. It's not about you personally, it's about the fact that people see what they want to see, and that shapes everything. The world around us isn't as neutral as we sometimes think." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah, for the first time, realized how many layers there were to this conversation. It wasn't just about gloves, or hygiene, or even about the flight. It was about how people saw each other, how they interacted, and how quickly assumptions could form based on little more than surface-level impressions. She had done what she had always done. She had put on gloves and approached him, no different than any other passenger, but the moment had been colored by something deeper. The passengers around them had been watching, and it seemed like they had all drawn their own conclusions without ever asking a single question. Sarah wanted to say something in response, to clarify, to explain, but she couldn't find the words. She didn't know how to express the confusion that clouded her thoughts. How could she possibly explain to him that she hadn't meant anything by it, that she had never once considered the possibility of making an assumption? But even as the thought crossed her mind, Sarah realized the problem was that she had made an assumption. She had assumed he was just another passenger, just another routine, another unremarkable moment in a flight that was supposed to be nothing more than a brief exchange of service. And yet, here they were, caught in the tension of something that wasn't ordinary at all. She tried to gather her thoughts, but before she could speak, Michael continued. His voice was steady, as though he had practiced this before, and Sarah realized that this wasn't the first time he had had this conversation with someone. I know what you're thinking, he said, his voice soft but firm. You're wondering if you did something wrong. The thing is, it's not about what you did. It's about what I'm used to, what people expect of me before I even say a word. I don't know how much you've dealt with that kind of thing, but I've lived it. Every single day of my life. The weight of his words was like a slow, creeping realization. Sarah had never considered how deeply ingrained these judgments were in the world around her. She had always thought of herself as open-minded, someone who didn't judge people based on their appearance, but now she began to question whether she had really been as open as she had believed. How often had she been in situations where she made judgments, whether consciously or unconsciously? Had she been part of the very problem Michael was speaking about? The thought made her stomach turn. Sarah looked around the cabin, at the passengers still watching her and Michael. They were all on edge, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. What would happen next? She could feel the weight of their eyes, the subtle pressure they placed on her to resolve the situation. But the truth was, there was no easy resolution. The problem wasn't just a misunderstanding between her and Michael, it was a misunderstanding that extended far beyond this one moment, beyond the confines of this flight. It was a reflection of the way society often treated people based on assumptions, based on appearances. And no amount of apologies or explanations would make that go away. Michael, sensing her internal conflict, gave her a small, understanding smile. It's okay, he said. I'm not angry. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. This isn't just about you and me. It's about how we all interact with each other, how we all carry these invisible biases without even realizing it. That's the real issue. Sarah nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. She couldn't undo the moment, couldn't take back the gloves, but she could try to understand. She could try to learn. This wasn't just a conversation about her actions, it was a conversation about the world around them, the biases they all carried, even when they didn't know it. And as much as Sarah wanted to get back to the routine, to move past this uncomfortable moment, she realized that this conversation was far from over. It was just beginning. The implications of what Michael had said echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she started to truly understand how much more there was to people's stories than what was immediately visible. And then, just as suddenly as the moment had shifted, Michael stood up to leave. The flight attendants were about to make their rounds for a final check, and the aisle was getting crowded again. Before he moved away, he turned to Sarah one last time, his gaze steady but warm. Just remember, next time, it's never as simple as it seems. Don't judge a book by its cover. You never know what's inside. And with that, he walked down the aisle, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts, her mind swirling with the weight of what had just transpired. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of her duties, but her mind was far from the usual routine. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation, about the moment when she had grabbed the gloves without a second thought, about the assumptions she had made without even realizing it. She had always thought of herself as fair, as someone who treated everyone equally, but now she realized how easy it was to slip into old habits, to let unconscious biases take the lead. The rest of the passengers remained largely unaware of the conversation that had just unfolded, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in her, but in the way she saw the world. As the flight came to an end, the cabin lights flickered on, signaling the descent. The hum of the engines quieted as the plane neared its destination. But for Sarah, the journey had only just begun. The lessons from this flight, the questions it had raised, were ones she knew she would carry with her long after the plane had landed. The plane landed smoothly, the screech of the tires against the runway pulling Sarah out of her reverie. She watched as the passengers began gathering their things, preparing to disembark. The usual clatter of overhead bins and the rustling of seatbelts seemed distant, a mere backdrop to the swirling thoughts that kept her on edge. She had gone through the entire flight in a haze, her thoughts constantly returning to the conversation with Michael. The gloves, the assumptions, the heavy weight of his words, nothing seemed as simple as it had before. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She wasn't just going through the motions of serving passengers. She was someone caught in the complex web of bias, identity, and humanity that stretched far beyond her role. As the cabin door opened, the familiar buzz of disembarking passengers filled the air. But Sarah lingered, feeling the pull of something deeper. Michael had left an impression on her that she couldn't shake. She glanced at the door where he had exited, but he was already gone, disappearing into the crowd of passengers spilling into the terminal. For a brief moment, Sarah wondered if she would ever see him again, or if his words would fade with time. But deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. His words had carved a mark in her consciousness that would never fade. The world he described, the world of assumptions, of judging without understanding, wasn't something she could ignore. It wasn't something anyone could ignore. Sarah was left standing there, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on treating people equally. She had prided herself on her ability to remain neutral, to show kindness and professionalism regardless of who sat in her section. But what Michael had pointed out wasn't about neutrality, it was about actively seeing people, about understanding that there was so much more beneath the surface. He had spoken to her not just as a passenger, but as someone who had lived through things she couldn't even imagine. And in that moment, Sarah realized that her entire perspective had shifted. She couldn't unsee the world as it had been painted for her. She couldn't unhear the lessons Michael had shared with her, however indirectly. The rest of the passengers trickled out of the cabin, some offering polite smiles, others too wrapped up in their own lives to notice the emotional storm brewing within Sarah. She methodically collected the remaining trash and straightened the aisles, but her mind kept circling back to Michael. She had been so caught up in the routines of her job that she had never thought much about the impact of her actions or the assumptions she may have been unknowingly making. She had always assumed that she could treat everyone the same, that everyone received the same level of courtesy and respect. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that wasn't true. Every person who boarded that plane carried a story, an experience, and a history that shaped the way they saw the world and the way they were seen by others. As the last passengers filed out, Sarah stood in the now empty cabin, the quiet almost suffocating after the energy of the flight. She wiped down the armrests, trying to focus on the task at hand, but her hands trembled slightly. Her actions felt mechanical, like she was going through the motions, without really feeling connected to what she was doing. The routine that had once been comforting now felt hollow, almost artificial. She had always believed that her role was to be neutral, to serve without judgment, but Michael had cracked open something inside her that couldn't be ignored. By the time Sarah finished cleaning the cabin and made her way to the back of the plane, the rest of the crew had already started to debrief. The chatter was light, nothing out of the ordinary, but Sarah found it difficult to engage. She had always been a part of the camaraderie that the flight crew shared, but now she felt like an outsider, her thoughts miles away from the banter. She sat down in the jump seat, her gaze fixed on the door as she absent-mindedly listened to the debriefing. "Hey, Sarah, you okay?" one of her fellow flight attendants asked, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Amelia, a colleague who had worked with her on countless flights. Amelia was younger, fresh-faced, and enthusiastic, always eager to chat about the latest passenger drama or gossip from the crew room. But today, Sarah couldn't bring herself to smile. "I'm fine," Sarah said, her voice sounding more distant than she intended. "Just, a lot on my mind." Amelia didn't push. She'd seen Sarah go through moments like this before, times when something deep had settled into her thoughts, something that couldn't be easily shaken. Amelia had no idea what had happened on this flight, but Sarah's expression said everything. When the debriefing ended, Sarah made her way to the crew room. The usual buzz of conversation greeted her, but she wasn't really listening. She needed a moment to herself, to process everything she had learned in the past few hours. She grabbed a coffee from the break room and sat by the window, her thoughts racing once more. She found herself staring out at the city, but it wasn't the view that held her attention. It was the question that had taken root in her mind: how many people had she unknowingly judged in her life? How many times had she made assumptions about others based on nothing but their appearance, their behavior, or even just the color of their skin? She thought back to her own upbringing, to the world she had been taught to see. Her parents had raised her with a sense of fairness, with the belief that everyone deserved respect. But even with those values, she had lived in a bubble, surrounded by people who were similar to her, who shared the same experiences. It wasn't until this moment, until Michael had forced her to confront her own biases, that she realized how little she truly knew about the lives of others. The more Sarah reflected, the more she realized just how much she had taken for granted. She had never truly examined the way the world worked outside of her own perspective. The discomfort that had settled inside her wasn't just about the gloves or the flight, it was about the systemic inequalities that she had never had to face. It was about the realization that her role as a flight attendant was more than just service, it was a reflection of the world in miniature, where people from all walks of life came together, each carrying their own burdens and histories. As the day wore on and her shift ended, Sarah found herself lingering at the airport, not quite ready to go home. The usual rush to leave, to get on with her life, had faded. She was no longer sure where her place was in this complex world. The path forward wasn't clear, but one thing was, she would never look at the world the same way again. She had started to see beyond the surface, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. But she also knew that this wasn't something she could walk away from. Michael had given her a glimpse into something much bigger than herself. It was a truth she wasn't yet ready to fully embrace, but one she couldn't ignore. The flight had ended, but for Sarah, the journey had just begun. The questions Michael had raised were only the beginning of a conversation that would span much longer than just one plane ride. And as she walked out of the terminal and into the cool evening air, she felt something new, a quiet resolve to begin understanding, to begin changing. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to stop questioning the world. Not now, not ever again. The next few days blurred by, each one a whirlwind of routine and reflection. Sarah couldn't shake the weight of the conversation she had shared with Michael, nor the sense of unease that lingered in her thoughts. The world she had once seen with clarity now appeared muddled, her previous assumptions about people and life starting to feel inadequate. She went through her days as if on autopilot, performing her flight attendant duties with precision but little enthusiasm. The gloves, the judgments, and the quiet yet profound conversation had shifted something deep within her. What had once seemed so simple, the process of serving passengers, maintaining professionalism, and getting through a flight, now seemed so much more complex, filled with layers of meaning she had never considered before. It wasn't just about the gloves anymore, or even about Michael. It was about the way the world worked, the way people interacted with one another, often without even realizing the implications of their actions. The experience had pushed her to examine her own biases, her own blind spots, and, most importantly, how those things shaped the way she saw others and was seen by them. She had always believed that she was an empathetic person, someone who could connect with others on a deeper level. But Michael's words had made her question whether she had ever truly connected with anyone in the way they deserved. The days that followed were filled with quiet, uncomfortable moments where Sarah found herself watching people more carefully than she had ever done before. She noticed the way some passengers averted their gaze when a crew member walked by, or how certain individuals tensed when a stranger took a seat next to them. She saw the way some passengers hurried to collect their belongings at the end of a flight, as though they couldn't wait to escape from the presence of others. But there were also moments that made her pause, moments where people helped each other with a shared smile or a kind word, moments that reminded her that human connection was still alive in small but meaningful ways. The next flight she worked was different from all the others. It was a short haul, not nearly as crowded as some of her longer trips, but it felt heavier, like the air itself was charged with something unspoken. As she went through her usual safety checks and began preparing the cabin, Sarah found herself thinking about Michael again. He had spoken so candidly about the assumptions people made, about how they didn't take the time to truly see one another. She had carried his words with her for days, replaying them in her mind, wondering what he would think if he could see her now, wondering if he would be proud of the effort she was beginning to make to change her perspective. During the flight, a couple sat in the first row, both in their 50s, clearly well-traveled and at ease with the world. Sarah noticed the way they interacted with each other, gentle, kind, and comfortable. They were the type of passengers who made her job easier, who smiled at every little gesture and said thank you with sincerity. It was small, but it made Sarah feel like the work she was doing mattered. After the meal service, when she returned to check on the couple, the man looked up from his book and caught her eye. "Hey, Sarah, is everything okay?" he asked, his tone friendly but perceptive. The question caught Sarah off guard. She smiled, nodding as she adjusted her apron, but then she realized he hadn't asked out of mere politeness. There was something in his eyes, a recognition that she hadn't noticed before. He could see that something was different about her, something had changed in the way she was interacting with the passengers. "Yeah," she said, almost unsure of herself. "Just thinking about some things." "Good things, I hope," he said with a small smile. She smiled back, the ease of his presence settling some of the storm within her. "Yeah. I think so. It's just been a bit of a wake-up call." The man didn't press further, but nodded as though he understood. There was no judgment, no need for further explanation. Sometimes, the kindness of a stranger could be just as healing as a long conversation. After the flight, as Sarah was preparing to leave the plane for the final time that day, she was stopped by one of the senior crew members, Alex. He was an older flight attendant, someone Sarah had always admired for his calm demeanor and experience. Alex had worked with her on many flights, and although they didn't talk often, there was an unspoken bond between them. He had noticed the shift in her behavior, in the way she had been moving through the days with a more thoughtful, deliberate air. "You've been different lately," Alex said as Sarah grabbed her bag from the crew compartment. "I don't know what's going on, but I can see it. And I'm glad." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She wanted to tell him everything, the conversation with Michael, the things she had learned, the way the world had suddenly shifted before her eyes. But the words felt inadequate, not because she wasn't willing to share, but because she wasn't sure how to put it into context. How do you explain a change in perspective that feels as though it has come from deep inside you, from something beyond the surface? "I've just been thinking about how people see each other," Sarah said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "And how often we don't really see each other, you know?" Alex raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but instead of pushing her to elaborate, he just nodded. "Yeah. I think I know what you mean. It's easy to get caught up in the daily grind, in the routines. But sometimes, something happens, and it makes you look at everything in a new light." Sarah didn't know why, but hearing Alex say those words made everything feel a little more real, a little more tangible. It wasn't just her thinking this way, it was something that others experienced as well. That realization gave her hope. When she finally stepped out of the airport, the weight that had hung over her for the past several days seemed to lift just a little. She still didn't have all the answers, and she still didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let Michael's words fade away. She was going to carry them with her, keep them close, and make an active effort to understand people beyond what her eyes could see. There were still so many things she didn't know, so many assumptions she had yet to unlearn. But today, Sarah felt like she had taken her first real step toward seeing the world through different eyes. And so, as she walked to her car under the evening sky, her mind wandered not to the past, but to the future. The questions Michael had left her with weren't just about her own growth, they were questions for the world at large. What would it take for society to see people as they truly were, not as they appeared to be? How many more conversations like this needed to happen before things started to change? Sarah didn't have the answers yet, but she was beginning to understand that the journey toward real change was just that, a journey. One she was now ready to take. The days following that shift were a blur of fleeting thoughts and moments that settled into Sarah's mind like fragments of a puzzle she wasn't sure how to complete. Every shift felt both like routine and revolution. She had always prided herself on being a professional, someone who could navigate through the hustle of in-flight service with grace and efficiency. But now, each moment in the air felt charged with the questions Michael had raised, the weight of his words pressing on her with each interaction, each decision she made. The gloves, that simple yet profound gesture, lingered in her thoughts, transforming into a symbol of the complexities of human relationships. Sarah found herself evaluating the smallest of interactions, each one a potential reflection of something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface. That Friday evening, she was assigned to another long-haul flight, one that would take her across the country. It was a familiar route, a regular rotation she had done countless times before, but this time she approached it with an awareness she hadn't had before. As she walked onto the aircraft and greeted the passengers with her usual professionalism, she noticed how different the experience felt. There were families, business travelers, people on their phones or reading books, all of them plugged into their own worlds, each with their own stories. In every face, Sarah began to see the potential for a narrative, stories she had never thought to explore before. Mid-flight, she passed by a middle-aged man who was reading a novel. He looked up briefly, meeting her gaze with a faint but genuine smile. She couldn't help but notice the way his eyes seemed to search hers for something, some kind of recognition. It was a subtle moment, but it was one that reminded her of the profound impact even the smallest interactions could have. She had never considered how much someone's eyes could convey, how much they could say without saying a word. Was it a smile of politeness, or was there more to it? In that instant, she felt a deeper connection to this stranger, a fleeting but undeniable moment of understanding. It made her realize that sometimes, what we choose not to say says more than words ever could. The more Sarah thought about her experiences with Michael, the more she realized that his challenge to her was not just about a single act of service. It was about how we view and treat one another in our everyday lives, and how easy it is to fall into the trap of seeing people for their surface characteristics rather than their humanity. She thought back to the passengers she'd interacted with before, the ones who had been rude or dismissive, the ones who hadn't looked her in the eye, who had made her feel small. She had always written them off as difficult or entitled, but now, Sarah was beginning to see them through a different lens. Maybe they weren't just rude or entitled, maybe they were carrying burdens she couldn't understand, maybe they felt unseen in ways she had never considered. One of the things Michael had said to her echoed in her mind as she walked down the aisle, collecting trash from the trays. When people look at you, what do they see? Do they see someone who is just a flight attendant, or do they see someone who has a life, who has struggles, who has a story? The thought felt like a revelation, one that she hadn't truly understood until now. Sarah had always prided herself on her ability to serve others, to make their lives easier, but now she wondered, how often did she forget to see them in return? How many times had she seen only the surface of someone's story and walked away without even attempting to understand their depth? As she completed the cabin service, she noticed a young woman sitting near the back, staring out the window. The woman's face was unreadable, but there was something in her posture that made Sarah pause. She had a quiet, introspective air about her, and Sarah felt a strange sense of empathy for her. It was one of those moments when you know someone is lost in thought, maybe even going through something difficult, but they're keeping it all inside, not sharing with anyone around them. The woman caught Sarah's eye, and for a moment, there was a flicker of connection. Sarah didn't say anything, but she smiled, softly, as if to say, "I see you." The woman's eyes softened in return, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Sarah knew it wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt important. The flight was long, but it felt shorter than usual. As they neared their destination, Sarah went through the motions of final checks, ensuring the cabin was ready for landing. She had taken off her gloves after the first service, but the weight of them still lingered in her mind. For the first time, she understood the symbolism of that moment with Michael. The gloves weren't just about protecting herself, they were about the invisible walls we build between ourselves and others. They were about how easy it is to disconnect, to assume things about people based on stereotypes or surface-level observations. The truth was, she had worn those gloves without even realizing it, unconsciously creating barriers between herself and the passengers she served. Michael had opened her eyes to the fact that those barriers didn't need to exist, not in her role as a flight attendant, not in life. As the plane touched down, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. It was subtle, but profound. She wasn't sure what the future held or how much she could change the way she saw the world, but she was determined to keep moving forward. There were still so many lessons to learn, so many ways to grow, and she knew she had only scratched the surface. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was seeing the world with fresh eyes. She had come to understand that every person she encountered, every passenger who walked down the aisle, had their own story to tell. And while she couldn't know all of them, she could at least try to see beyond the surface. She could offer kindness, empathy, and most importantly, understanding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When the crew gathered for their final debriefing, Sarah's mind was quieter than it had been in days. She was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of the new understanding that was taking root inside her. But she knew one thing for sure, she was no longer just going through the motions. She was more than a flight attendant. She was a person, engaging with others who were also human, each with their own complexities and stories. The gloves may have been a symbol of her own distance, but now, she was ready to take them off, metaphorically and literally. She had begun to see the world in a way that was raw, honest, and full of potential. And that, more than anything, gave her hope. As she stepped off the plane, the evening sky stretched above her in soft hues of purple and orange. The journey ahead seemed uncertain, but for the first time, Sarah didn't mind. She was ready to keep learning, to keep growing, and to keep seeing the world and the people around her in ways she never had before. The questions Michael had left her with would stay with her for a long time, but they weren't burdens anymore, they were invitations to see, to understand, and, most importantly, to connect. And with that, Sarah felt like she was finally starting to see the world the way it was meant to be seen, not through gloves or barriers, but with open hands and an open heart.